Okay, at 6 minutes past 4, I'd like to welcome everyone to the launch of our latest Speculative Vacancies report. My name's Emily Sims, and I am one of the members of the team here at Prosper Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that I am hosting this Zoom webinar from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and sovereignty was never ceded. Today, Karl Fitzgerald, the author of our Speculative Vacancies report, will be taking us through our findings. We were really glad to see that the report was well covered in the media last week, but I'm sure you have many questions. I've already had a few over email about methodology and things like that. So without further ado, welcome, and I'll hand it over to Karl.
Thanks, Emily. Yes, welcome everyone to our 10th report into Melbourne's vacancy troubles. As I get this slideshow underway, yeah, I'm lucky to be broadcasting here from Jajarwarung country. This is the view out my office window, so I've been very lucky to be able to investigate the edge of Melbourne's housing crisis is what I see these vacancy findings revealing. So yeah, here we go. We've got vacancies up 13.3% since our 2017 data. This report, of course, is based on 2019 data where land prices skyrocketed by $136 billion over that financial year. So that was quite a shock after land prices falling twice what they did during the GFC, and then the pandemic wiping out the latter half of that financial year, so the most recent financial year. So yeah, land prices continue to increase, and we're led to believe that this is a persistent puzzle. But hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you will garner a new insight on this last remaining tenet of trickle-down economics, supply side theory. Why is it so dominant in housing circles still? So here, over time, we can see our vacancy numbers. They've been pretty well consistent. You can see in the upper line there, we have the 50 litre vacancy measure. Just a little bit on the methodology. Many of you will understand that a leaking tap, a leaking system can leak some 160 litres of water a day. So we put 50 litres as a reasonable threshold, considering that average per person consumption levels at the in 2019 were 162 litres per day. So for an average household, that's about 419 litres a day. So 50 litres is reasonable when you consider that some 47 billion litres of water is lost through leakages in our system. That's quite a lot when we only have 30 billion litres dedicated towards environmental flows. So yeah, you can see there that vacancies on that 50 litre measure have pretty well been above 60,000 sites for this 9 years. We have 10 years, we have solid data on 50 litres, but for 0 litres, we started collecting that in 2010, and you can see that it's pretty well punched above 20,000 sites since 2013. So they're considerable numbers, and soon we're going to see the property sales numbers and start to recognise how influential they are on supply levels. Now, this was the first time that we found a rather obscure spreadsheet on the Victorian Valuer General's data set that found 63,000 sites were deemed assessments, property assessments without buildings. So that is similar to our 69,000 vacancies, and it's good to find supportive data sets that build up and confirm the evidence base of what we've talked about over time for so long. So why are accurate vacancy measures so important? And here we have figure 2 in the report. The speculative vacancies there in green are ignored in vacancy measures. They're not included. And when we started doing this report, the vacancy rate was measured via a voluntary survey of real estate agents. So of course, they'd only really report when they had low vacancy rates, manufacturing, a sense of scarcity, and not really reflecting all the sites that have been held for perhaps speculative purposes. There are many other issues that do relate to vacancy, but we feel that in the drive from investors constituting about 10-12% of the market in the 1980s to now punching around about 38-40% of the market, sometimes up to 50%. That influence has really driven a change in the way housing is seen. And homes are no longer for housing. There's a lot of emphasis around passive income and income streams, and we feel that commodification is something that must be checked by a fairer tax system. So here's our top 20 vacancy map. Most of the suburbs that were in the 2017 report featured again this year. You can see that largely towards the eastern suburbs there, the vacancies were held. And it's of note that the western suburbs, which largely inspired this report, aren't featured in the top 20, and we're working on improving data in the west. We feel, according to that Valuer General's data set, there was some 23,000 sites with 0 litres of water, without buildings on them. So there's certainly a strong indication here that the eastern suburbs, where the capital gains are greatest, may be driving investor behaviour. Okay, one of the other aspects that we keep a close eye on, of course, is the land supply, the broadacre land supply coming through. And you can see here, courtesy of DELP, their urban development plan report releases this a very handy graph. And you can see between 2007 and 2010 that the land supply coming through the pipeline was around about 150,000 lots. And due to incessant demands from the property lobby, those land supplies were increased, virtually doubled, and then some, up beyond 350,000 land sites for the last 8-9 years. So that's a significant amount of land coming through the market. And in that report, they found through these growth areas of Casey, Hume, Melton, Whittlesea and Wyndham that there was an average 21 years of land supply, and some areas had up to 33 years worth of land supply. So what percentage of potential land sales of that 370,000 took place in 2019? Well, think about it. Pick a number. What do you reckon it was? 1.94%. Some 7,183 lots were sold to the market to encourage competition. So, there's a need for greater pressure on those with market power, with control of these land sites. And when we have a vacancy measure that doesn't record either those sites that have already been rezoned and already have their water meters turned on. That's really, important that we do understand what our latent supply is, particularly during an era where the housing supply mantra pretty well dominates policy circles. So we're flying blind without an accurate vacancy measure. And I will point out that those 370,000 lots are largely not included in our vacancy findings because they're broadacre lots without their water meters turned on as of yet. So property sales in 2019, what happened? We had about 50,000 homes sold, 28,000 apartments, and yeah, vacant house blocks is what the Valuer General defines them as, just above 7,100. So there were 84,000, nearly 85,000 property sales. And here we are saying, look, there's 69,000 potential vacancies that need to have greater pressure applied to them. But hey, supply only matters when guys like this want their rezoning windfall. But I'm increasingly coming to believe that land supply is a fair weather friend of housing affordability. I'm looking forward to bringing you a new report going further up the production pipeline to analyse what happens with those 370,000 lots. So let's have a look in one of those growth areas, Melbourne South. You can see in the bottom graph there, the number of sales between 18 and 19 has, dropped quite significantly and then plateaued. But the house prices in the top graph have been maintained. So there was a correction through 17, 18, and supply often has a bit of a lag on it. So they tightened up on supply to ensure that house prices didn't fall. This is a sort of analysis we'd love to see the government undertaking when looking at the sort of public policy return they're getting for so much rezoning going on out there. The people need to see some affordability returns, and unfortunately, doesn't seem to be part of the picture at present. So we were very excited in March 2017 when the Victorian government announced a vacant residential property tax. We thought, finally, here's some action. We're going to see some pressure applied to these hoarders that we do note each and every year. Now, after much toing and froing, I've finally got the release of the data set surrounding the vacancy tax from the State Revenue Office. And this is the first time this has been published, particularly the most recent financial year. You can see that in 2017-18, 469 property owners self-declared 716 properties. Our absolute vacancies during that year with 0 litres of water were 21,000 lots there. So the number of properties that self-declared compared to what we revealed was just 3.4%. And instead of the $6.2 million they raised, they should have raised somewhere between $147 million for absolute vacancies, right up to some 500 million if speculative vacancies were pursued. So it's a significant disparity there, and the government really needs to do better on recognising that there's a need to apply pressure to these properties, and a significant revenue flow is available there. So, Yeah, I was very frustrated during the middle of the pandemic when the government announced they were going to spend $150 million housing the homeless in hotels. Sounds like as of last week, that's starting to wind up and people are being ushered back out onto the streets. Well, instead of, paying that $150 million, wouldn't it be good if we had a government that was engaged in holistic reform that was ensuring that these vacant properties were put to the market so that the pressure further up the property chain was reduced and less people would be pushed into homelessness. But unfortunately, property owners who couldn't put their property on the market prior to the pandemic were given official sanction to do as little as need be with their property during the pointy end of our housing crisis. So I think we deserve better here in Victoria. I think the government has much to answer for on this, and we'll be looking forward to pushing them towards improving their process. Because when we look at what our absolute vacancies reveal versus what was self-declared, there's a long way to go. And we were shocked to find out that zero fines have been levied on anyone revealed not to have self-declared their property. And we found out through our meetings with the water bodies that they weren't providing any of the oversight required to reveal these vacant sites. Now, of course, we only get the postcode level vacancy. Sorry, dear squatters, but I'm sure the government could get the address specific sites and via tax records track down who the appropriate owners are. So there's really no excuse for this. And yeah, there are better examples around the world of what can happen. And just a cursory look at these figures, you might think that the vacancy tax is doing its job and the number of assessments self-declaring is falling, so maybe the vacancy tax is working. Well, that's where it's good that we have an alternative measure to apply pressure and reveal what's really going on. So yeah, zero fines and little oversight, very disappointing after we were involved in some of the preliminary discussions to set up this vacancy tax here in Victoria. So what about what's happening around the world? Well, here's Vancouver. And their vacancy numbers are falling quite rapidly. We're not aware of any water-based measure being used there to add transparency to these numbers, but we do know they have a $10,000 a day penalty for those busted for not self-declaring, and they have been willing to pursue property owners who haven't declared their property, costing huge amounts of money for the property owner. So yeah, they've also been very forthright in engaging the public, bringing them on side, linking the revenues from vacancy with the provision of further affordable housing, lots of outreach through libraries, lots of education of property owners. And their vacancy tax combined accounts for 37% of rental income for domestic investors. For foreign investors, that's 75% of rental income when you include the British Columbia tax as well, which I think brings it up to 1.5%. But it's just been announced in the last week that Vancouver is going to triple their vacancy rate tax from 1% to 3%. So for those interested in how a holding charge on land works and at what rate it needs to be set to trigger a response within the market, this is a very interesting piece of evidence that's coming into play right as we speak. So it's obvious they're acting with conviction. They're moving rapidly to ensure that housing is returned as a priority for homeowners over investors. And that's something we'd like to see happen here in Australia, where land prices have taken off just so rapidly. Again and again, we keep saying it, and it's almost been normalized now. So what happens here in Victoria? Well, we found this property investor who didn't even know that the vacant residential property tax was in existence here in Melbourne. So that was the front page of The Age last week when we launched the report. And it is surprising the government's not doing more to educate the public on the need for this vacancy tax and how putting pressure on some 69,000 homes to enter the market would push prices downwards, a stated public policy objective of over 20 odd years. So this was something that's new for our report, is looking at vacancy over time, now that we have some 10 years of our own data set. And let's visit the Melbourne CBD. And we tend to think that the difference between the 0 litres and 50 litres, the 0 litres picks up the big development projects, whereas the 50 litre measure looks at the more general latency throughout the market. And Carlton South, you can see in the top graph there, vacancies 2013 were up close to 10%, and it took 4 or 5 years for them to sell down the developments there. And that's a reasonable amount of market power, isn't it, to have valuable sites that are sitting vacant and slowly let to the market over time. So you can see between 2010 to 2014 was when Matthew Guy was the Minister for Planning, and probably one of the most aggressive supply-siders the world's ever seen. Mr. Skyscraper was his nickname, and the Melbourne skyline got redesigned into a bar graph of potential affordability. Well, between 2010 and 14, apartment prices increased by some 7.8%, and up to 2017, apartment prices were up 25.8%. So we had a lot of supply coming into the market, but still that wasn't enough to dent prices. And we feel it's because this market power of being able to hold sites and slowly drip feed them according to demand is a powerful mechanism that governments need to be looking more closely at. This is a poster, a sketchy photo of mine, but it sums up what's going on in the inner north of Melbourne. The gentrification game, artists set the scene, speculators wipe it clean. And have a look here in the inner north through the hipster belt, and you can see that something happened in 2014-15, and it seemed like the assembly of major development sites took off according to that 0 litres of water graph at the top. And of course, in mid-2013, Matthew Guy announced the neighbourhood residential zones, limiting multi-storey developments in some areas. And when we look at the 50 litres down below, we can see Brunswick East, for example, has just gone through the roof as the number of sites using 50 litres 50 litres of water a day. And we feel that investors knew that property prices were growing, and when they're growing faster than rents, there's no real reason to put them on the market, particularly when that added scarcity helps to push up land values, property values, and that's, after all, what investors are really after. So there's more to learn from these graphs, but we feel that when we look at what happened in the Middle Eastern suburbs around Box Hill, Burwood, Glen Waverley, that with Box Hill being picked as a major activity centre that in Plan Melbourne, that perhaps rewarded some of the patient capital that had seen what had gone on closer into the city with this neighbourhood residential zoning, and they bought out in Box Hill near these infrastructure hubs of Glen Waverley and Burwood, and waited for the potential rezoning to come through. We also know that there's a strong cultural attraction out in those regions as well. So investors knew that people of Chinese descent wanted to buy into those areas. So perhaps buying and holding was a fruitful endeavour. Okay, well, we're coming up to question time, so get your questions lined up. But the recommendations, just a summary of some of them in our report. But for the current land tax system, to gradually reduce land tax thresholds, properties only pay land tax from $250,000 in value and above. And so that means that the remaining affordable communities we have are prime targets if you're an investor trying to get in the game. So we think that those land tax thresholds should be reduced. We're lucky in Victoria, they've halted increasing them, but in places like New South Wales and Queensland, they actually have them indexed to their median land values. So every time the median goes up, the incentive to invest in the last remaining affordable communities also increases. So it's a vicious cycle, a cat chasing its tail sort of thing as prices head northwards. So by reducing that land tax threshold, it would ensure that there's a greater penalty for speculative investors holding properties out of the market. And that, of course, is one of the drivers for why Prosper Australia is so passionate about land tax reform. And in saying that, we've been super busy this year with all the discussion around the THODI review out of New South Wales and replacing stamp duties with a land tax. That's obviously the best form of vacancy tax, is a broad-based land tax set at an effective rate. And that's the key point. We know the property lobby really wants to broaden land taxes so they can reduce their overall bill. But for us, we want to find that holding charge that is an effective opportunity cost on not earning a rental income. So that's the challenge we have there. If we are to stick with a vacant residential land tax like we have in Victoria, it needs to be broadened. It can't just be limited to the inner and middle ring suburbs. I didn't point that out earlier on our heat map, but that vacancy boundary is highlighted on that graph, and really it hasn't had any effect. There's no great jump in vacancies outside that boundary. Like Vancouver, we'd like to see heavier penalties, and we believe that water consumption is the best measure to monitor vacancy, primarily because you can't change water providers mid-billing cycle like you can with electricity, for example. So problems of data matching and so forth are not such a problem with water consumption. One that we think could be of use to governments is to investigate an escalating land tax over time. So if a developer is talking to their investors through the prospectus on a 33-year development window, that's a sign that land prices are probably going to have at least quadrupled by the time that 33 years is over. That's really quite a return they're receiving there. So there must be a fairer return for all the public infrastructure that goes on surrounding that site, and escalating land taxes are a way to counterbalance the market power some of these master plan communities have in their particular region. So in finishing, please write to your MP asking why we haven't got more accurate vacancy statistics, why we haven't got a better vacancy tax, why, isn't the Victorian government taking it seriously about replacing stamp duty with a higher land tax. So thank you, and let's move on to some questions. All right.
Muted. Hello, thanks very much, Karl. This was a great presentation. We have a few questions. We've got one here from Rick Rybeck, who asks whether it's important to distinguish between vacant buildings and vacant lots, or is it okay just to lump them all together?
We'd certainly like to see that distinguishment, particularly because vacant buildings do depreciate over time, whereas vacant land does increase. And if you have two vacant sites, one with a vacant building, it will be worth less than the vacant site, because often that vacant building will have to be demolished. So yeah, language is certainly important, and that's why we're being frustrated that the Victorian government has changed the terminology from our vacancy tax here. It was called a vacant residential property tax, and that was correct because it was a tax on the land plus the improvements. But somewhere along the way they changed it to a vacant residential land tax, even though it's a charge on the land and improvements. So that was a bit frustrating.
We have a question from Ben Debney, who asks about the link between, he says, there's been reports in the news about urban sprawl encroaching on native habitats and leading to species extinction. How close is the link in your mind between this development and the government's interest in bringing in land taxes? He goes on to elaborate by saying there's a strong, from what I understand, the government has a strong incentive from the point of view of collecting taxes to encourage speculation by opening up more land for urban sprawl. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about the ecological consequences of speculation-driven sprawl in general.
Yes, well, we support higher land taxes because it will encourage the city to build upwards rather than outwards. And by having a limited vacancy tax, it encourages further sprawl. It encourages concreting over our valuable wildlife. And yeah, it's a big concern. Are governments addicted to property tax revenue? That's a criticism we often hear, and we'd like to think that with a higher land tax, it would actually level out the boom bust, so there wouldn't be such oscillations in stamp duty revenues, for example, and so there'd be a greater ability of government to forward plan. But when they're stuck on this stamp duty roller coaster, it can seem like they're trying to open up more and more land because they want more one-off sales, whereas the land tax that everyone pays a little bit each year would actually encourage all of these vacant sites to be utilised. So we use them first and we limit this sprawl.
So there is this natural kind of relationship between the tax base and the strategic planning in Melbourne, which is mostly about densification and ensuring that we are building up, not out. So what you're saying is that the move, for example, that was announced in New South Wales recently to move from stamp duty to land tax might be bringing the tax base or the revenue base in line with the broader strategic objectives of land use planning.
Very well said.
So you'll be happy to know, Karl, that we have a few questions from Jessie, who asks, what would be some good uses for vacancy tax revenue which could sell a reformed vacancy tax politically? That's a Dorothy Dixer, if ever I've heard one.
It certainly is, Jesse. Yes, well, if the government was committed to putting this, 150 million plus dollars to work, we think that the ACT's Canberra land rent model is, certainly has to be tried in the Victorian context. And near Docklands, there is EDOC. And it's a big scrap over what developer is going to get access to that. Well, we'd love to see a public interest aspect there where, like a community land trust, this would be a government-run one in a way, could, if there was interest, be a full community-run operation. But the ACT model is very interesting because landowners there don't have to borrow for the land component. They just pay a 2% land rent fee to the government each year. And because of that, it's a handy little revenue flow for government. And, people living there are saving some 37% over a decade compared to traditional renting. So, when you need $120,000 for a deposit to get into the market these days, it sounds very attractive if you only really need to borrow to buy the improvements under such a land rent scheme. So, seen a lot of movement around the world along these lines, but here in Australia, there's been a lot of talk, but no one's actually done anything yet.
Do you think it would be a problem to try and tax vacancies, just building on the idea of this vacancy tax that we currently have in Victoria? Would it be a problem to try and tax vacancies in a weak rental market due to limited immigration into metropolitan areas? I mean, we know that Tim Palace has waived the vacancy tax for this year due to the COVID crisis. Does it still make sense in a falling market to tax vacancies as highly as we wanted to prior to COVID? Does it still make sense to tax vacancies in a rental market that's fallen off a cliff? What do we think about this waiver?
Yeah, well, I believe that with land prices increasing, that's what the tax is largely looking to capture a share of. And sure, the rental market is correcting at the moment, but plenty of those investors are putting their property on the market and making a handy profit right now. So I can't see a reason why the government shouldn't be taxing that. This is, after all, probably the best chance in a generation, if not 100 years, to return property back to a more affordable basis. So, we really need to be applying pressure on governments to recognise that with every extra dollar spent on our mortgage or our rent is an extra dollar that we can't spend in our local community, which is such a large jobs generator. And I didn't get to include it in the report, but something I'm really hoping we can build more pressure on and awareness about is what's going on in the non-residential market. So across industrial and commercial sites in 2019, there were plenty of stories about rising property prices in the industrial sector in particular, and what a vibrant market it was, and all sorts of reports saying there was a lack of supply. And when we got our water data, it's always reasonably shocking, but this was a big one to recognise that there were triple the amount of vacant non-residential sites as was sold last year. So when some categories of industrial warehouses were up 125%, during this supply side crisis, it just brings home how we need a more holistic analysis of what's going on with our land markets, particularly now in this post-pandemic era where economies really have to rebuild and get a move on. Cheaper rents, cheaper access to business sites is a key issue that we need more focus on.
We have a question here from Dan Sullivan. He asks, did the vacancy tax lead to token occupancies that were created just to escape the tax?
Hi, Dan. Good to hear from you over in America there. From what we understand, with 300, 400 people self-declaring, the tax has largely been ignored. So government hasn't done much advertising. Many property owners don't even know that it exists. So we don't know, haven't heard of token occupancies being undertaken, but there's certainly plenty of loopholes for property owners to get around the tax. If you're a business owner, working from home, for example, or working with a city type office abode, it's pretty easy to get around the tax.
I would like to add.
Yeah, go on.
I'd add to that, which is a token occupancy is still an occupancy, which is fine by me. Even if it's an informal arrangement, if the house is not being left empty, if it's being used, then that's housing someone. I mean, I don't know, Dan, we have quite a serious homelessness problem in Melbourne that has been increasing over the past 10 years. And I think during this COVID pandemic, for example, our state government housed nearly all of the rough sleeping homeless in our city to the tune of 150 mil, which was obviously money very well spent because people shouldn't be being at risk simply because they have nowhere to live. But we raised the point in the report that an effective vacancy tax would have covered the cost of that hotel bill. But I wonder what we think about what a token occupancy might look like. I know that I was more worried about people putting tap timers on and turning the taps on spuriously every 5 minutes in order to escape monitoring. We've got another question here from Brian Kavanagh. Wouldn't broad-based land taxes also act to continue the current pandemic drift to the regions? That can't be all bad for our glutted major cities.
Yes, Brian, that wouldn't be a bad thing at all. The problem is that the Victorian government has the regional first home buyers grant, handing first home buyers $20,000 to buy in regional areas. So land prices are skyrocketing at the moment, and living regionally where I do, we're getting a regular letterbox drops of properties selling, within hours of going on the market. A friend bid on a property recently, and within 6 hours it was gone. And properties are just getting snapped up left, right, and centre. So having a broad-based land tax would help to tax away some of those gains if it's set at a reasonable enough level. Some of the issues we're facing, though, is that not enough people know of the benefits of land taxes and why we economists are so passionate about them. And that sort of outreach agenda is increasingly important with what's going on in New South Wales as they edge closer and closer to replacing stamp duties with the land tax.
I have a question here from James Calder. He asks, how were the vacant green acre lots identified? Land zoned for residential use, but without a planning or subdivision permit.
That, James, I imagine you're talking about that chart from DELP with the 370,000 lots. Yeah, there's certainly broadacre lots within the urban growth boundary that have been rezoned. So they do have a subdivision permit at some level or another. So it's frustrating. We point out in the report how lot sizes, Victorian lot sizes, have shrunk from the typical quarter acre block, about 660 square metres, down to about 518 square metres now. Some properties barely have a picnic blanket's worth of a backyard. But of course, whilst the size has shrunk, the per metre cost has increased. So it's been a sneaky way developers have managed to maintain their profit margins.
We seem to have come to the end of questions from our attendees. If anybody has any further questions, please put them in the Q&A box now. If not, we might start to wrap things up.
I'll just finish off by saying, how this year I've been lucky enough to come into contact with some organisations on the international front. In the UK, there's a group there called Action for Empty Homes, and in New York, the LISC group, which is a massive NGO involved in a lot of refurbishment of vacant homes. And between the three organisations, we've established the Global Empty Homes Network, where we're trying to build up an international coalition of NGOs and so forth who are concerned about this increasing commodification of the place to call home. And we're looking to evaluate the best measures to return our communities to our people.
Speaking of returning communities to people, Karl, somebody's asked, Ben Devney rather, has asked, what part might housing cooperatives have in checking property speculation?
Yeah, well, housing cooperatives, sort of an ownership model, a non-corporate model of owning, but for us at Prosper Australia, it's really about how the locational value of the land is shared. And housing co-ops certainly very useful. For me, I like the community land trust model that's based on a yearly land lease. A lot of housing groups have a resale formula to try and limit the price growth. We'd prefer a yearly land lease fee to give the housing co-op some liquidity to pay off their debts, because when you get a good housing association set up, and everything's working beautifully. No one actually wants to leave, so the housing trust finds themselves in a liquidity shortfall and has to keep relying on philanthropic grants or government grants, whereas under a yearly land lease model, they would have their own financial sovereignty established. But certainly, yeah, working together is a way that we can address what's going on behalf of that community of people. And yeah, now we see all sorts of different investment models coming through, driving this model in the other direction with the sort of micro investment models that are coming through. Yeah, we need to check that as quick as we can.
And we have another question from Frederick Auld. Are you able to identify particular politicians who are sympathetic to your aims? I don't think we're ever allowed to name names, are we, Karl?
Yeah, it's amazing how many high-profile meetings we're having these days, and yeah, we're kind of sworn to secrecy in a way, particularly with the government agencies who are recognising the revenue pressures they're under, the affordability pressures that society's facing, and yeah, the public interest benefit of what we're talking about. But yeah, the leading person in Australia, you'd have to say, would be the New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet. He's been fantastic, really pushing this through. And, we always know we're going to be busy during a crisis, but we didn't recognise we'd be this busy with him just driving this agenda forward, making the most of the crisis. So we're doing what we can to support that important move.
And finally, I think as we're heading up to 5 o'clock, Kat Shakovsky asks, selling new taxes to people is difficult. What are some good ways you have found to get the idea across to people?
Yeah, well, telling the story of the original Monopoly game is probably the most powerful mechanism. The landlord's game, invented by Lizzie Maggie in 1904, I think, originally taught people about the dangers of monopoly capitalism, and unfortunately the game got subverted, and now you're surrounded by monopoly men wherever you look, and kind of it drives any housing advocate crazy, I dare say. But yeah, for me, having these vacancy numbers is a really good check on this supply side story that the policy circles are dominated by. And so being able to have these numbers and to see the percentage of growth of vacancies in particular suburbs and look at why that's occurring, yeah, it's always good to have fresh data from a new perspective. Always opens people's eyes.
Oh, we have a comment from Rick Rybeck. In answer to the last question about selling a new tax, perhaps we could emphasise the importance of untaxing the value of buildings. That might make the tax shift more appealing. Well,
yeah,
we've certainly done a fair bit of that.
Yeah, recently, it's always a good one to say that, facing higher property taxes for putting solar panels on your roof, yeah, it's not, it doesn't make sense. And that's why untaxing buildings and returning the tax to the land is important, because it encourages use of that vacant land, and it puts the family home and the vacant property on equal footing. And at present, our tax system does everything to ensure that the family home pays more in council rates than the land banker does. So, yeah, we return to that story every now and again.
Yeah. Certainly last year, if you recall, Karl, we did quite a bit of work on site value versus capital improved value rating systems for local government, because the Victorian government, many councils in Australia do their property taxes only on the site value, but in Victoria we were going to completely overhaul the Local Government Act and remove the option for a site value only rating in our local government system. So hopefully that won't be the case. Have we got a report from that review yet?
No, I don't think so.
I think it got COVIDed.
It did.
Got shunted into some other time once everybody is feeling healthy again. Well, I think that we will wrap it up. Thank you so much, Karl, for your presentation. And thank you to the 20 odd people who attended our webinar today. I hope you found it insightful. If you would like to hear more about Prosper's activities and the things that we're interested in, perhaps you're very interested in this local government ratings issue, head to our website, prosper.org.au, and you can subscribe to our e-news. We promise we won't spam you. You might also like to follow us on Twitter at ProsperAus, and definitely have a look at our LinkedIn profile there. We often post things on LinkedIn. And thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the week.